The world economy is projected to shrink sharply this year, exacerbating poverty and inequality. The United Nations World Economic Situation Prospects Report estimates that the global economy will lose nearly $8.5 trillion in output over the next 2 years, wiping out nearly all gains of the previous 4 years. Our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, spoke via Zoom with the United Nations chief economist, Elliot. He began by asking him about the implications of the report's dire projections.
I think we are facing a fundamental structural shift in the way our global economy works. For one thing, we have seen the degree of interconnectedness and how rapidly we are infected, if you will, by problems that are going on in any one place through the trade channels. And we've always known that we stand strong or fall apart together, but we were, I think, somewhat surprised at how rapidly these shocks were transmitted across countries. We've also seen, I think, how interconnected individual sectors are, that to the extent that we have a problem in the economy of a developed country, that the change in their demand structures can immediately have an impact on the tourism sector in a small island developing state on the other end of the world. And I think that has driven home more than any other factor in the last 30 years, the degree to which we all depend upon each other. Now, we've also seen as well that this crisis, although it affects us all differently. And there are many of us, for example, you and I, we're sitting here conducting our normal work online, but there are hundreds of millions of other people who cannot earn a wage unless they go out and execute their activities in close proximity to others, which means they're much more exposed to the damage of the crisis, and they may not be able to earn a living because their clients are not there because of the shutdown, the economic restrictions. And what that underscores more than, I think, any other phenomenon in the last 30 years is how deeply unequal our societies actually are. And we face a real problem, I think, even after the recovery starts, that some will have fallen even further behind, some countries, and even more important, some groups of people within countries. And we need to be sure in crafting our recovery approaches that we keep that in mind, that we try.
Let's talk a bit about that. Let me jump in here. The pandemic will likely cause, according to this report, an estimated 34.3 million people to fall below the extreme poverty line in this year alone. 56% of this increase occurring in African countries. An additional 130 million people may join the ranks of people living in extreme poverty by 2030. Is this pandemic an existential threat to the UN's development agenda, particularly the SDGs?
It is a threat. Whether it's an existential threat depends on the nature of the recovery. As the Secretary General pointed out from the very beginning, it's also an opportunity. We had been lagging behind with regard to some of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have an opportunity now to direct our recovery in ways that allow us to catch up lost ground. Yeah? Now, for example, we know that some of the measures that have been put in place, the emergency measures, have dealt with providing social protection to workers who have been directly affected by the crisis. That is a resilience-building measure, and we consider that that would be something that governments should build into the very fabric of their societies as a permanent fixture of their policy frameworks. This means that their societies have a greater degree of resilience going forward, are less subject to shocks in the future, and consequently less likely to fall off the pathway towards sustainable development should something untoward happen in the future. But by the same token, we understand that this is an opportunity as well to shape a more green and more sustainable type of economy. We have a lot of people who've lost jobs because of this crisis. We can direct our investments towards sustainable projects that might create what we call in the UN green jobs, decent work that can then provide a sustainable livelihood for people going forward. Sometimes
let's talk a bit about some of
it does give you a bit of an opportunity.
Let's talk about some of this shifting patterns we are observing, right? The pandemic has shaken the fundamental premise, and this is what it says in the report, of globalization, and yet the argument is essentially for more globalization, right? So explain that to some of the naysayers who believe that more protectionism now is the answer, given the disruptions we experienced in, for example, the global supply chains vis-a-vis personal protection equipment for some of the frontline workers dealing with this pandemic?
I think the main point here is that the prosperity gains that we've seen over the last 60 years have come primarily through our interaction with each other. There are very few countries that can pretend to be totally self-sufficient, and if they are or try to attain self-sufficiency, it is at a greater cost than the kind of prosperity they could have by trading with each other. Trade is an engine of growth, always has been, always will be. Anybody who tries to deny that is looking reality in the face and saying that reality doesn't exist. However, because we are more interconnected, we are much more dependent on each other's destinies. The way in which a shock affects our trading partner can have an implication for how our own economy functions. And that is not necessarily a bad thing as long as we have structures in place that allow us to deal with these kinds of shocks in a coordinated and cooperative manner. It is a fundamental error, I think, to believe that salvation lies in turning inward, in trying to hide behind a border, because in many respects this crisis is a perfect example of the fact that borders have become increasingly porous. The problems that we face as a global community don't stop at a national border. Climate change is not something that stays within one country, and similarly this pandemic as well. And so to respond effectively to something that affects us all, we should all respond collectively. It allows us then to support those who are less equipped to respond on that with their own resources. It allows us also to ensure that the response is appropriate. And that, I think, is a critical lesson that we should learn. Now, does that mean that globalization in its present form is perfect? By no means. And we should use this opportunity as well to learn some of the lessons from the past and see how, as we recover, we can recover with a stronger multilateral system and with a much more equitable form of global interaction.
So given the scale of what we're talking about, the depth and the severity of this crisis means that any recovery, as the report says, will be slow and painful. We're seeing governments increasingly torn between a public health emergency that has not gone away and the need to reopen economies due to the sheer economic burden that has been placed on individuals, families, and societies. Is there a balanced approach, Mr. Elliot, to the response we need to see from governments in this moment?
It is a very difficult trade-off, and you've hit the nail on the head. We can't save lives and ignore the fact that we also have to save the economy. We have to do what we can to keep things going at least a minimum level so that we have something to recover with. But again, I think the key point is governments need to consider very carefully how we reopen. We will find that it was much easier to shut things down than to reopen them. We'll have to consider how we reopen, and to do so in ways that minimize, to the extent possible, the risk of new waves of infection. Now, all sorts of different proposals have been put forward. So, for example, that one might want to stagger the work times, the shifts, so that we don't have the rush hour traffic with people crowded into subway cars and in close proximity to each other, that we can spread that out.
All right, that was the United Nations chief economist, Elliot Harris, in conversation with our Sherwin Bryce-Pease.